Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 99 called Worse Things Will Happen. We've now reached the tipping point in late Roman history when the true descent into anarchy and chaos began, when Western Eurasia underwent its most profound and sudden transformation since the reign of Alexander the Great, when the ancient world came to an end and a brand new religion rose to conquer much of the world. We're at one of the greatest turning points in history. And we begin on the banks of the mighty Danube River in the cold winter of 602, when the Roman army, freshly triumphant from its victories over the Avars and Slavs, received the disappointing news from the Emperor Maurice in Constantinople that he wanted it to advance over the river and spend the winter in enemy territory instead of staying in the much more comfortable towns, fortresses and barracks south of the river. Much scholarly ink has been spilt on why Maurice wanted his successful army to do something so unpopular, and something which would cost him not only all his lifetime achievements, but also his own life. We're fortunate in having a detailed account of the story from our main chronicler, Theophylact Simocarta, Simocarta being his nickname, which translated means snub-nosed cat, presumably referring to his appearance. Theophylact is absolutely clear why Maurice wanted the army to winter north of the Danube. It was to save money. Historians have suggested another possible motive, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, which was to continue the war with the Slavs in winter when their settlements were vulnerable. This could well have been true, but I think the main reason was money, and this goes back to the legacy Justinian had left his successors of an empire overstretched by acquisitions and without sufficient tax revenues to fund the army properly. Maurice was also in his 60s, an old man by the standards of his time, and out of touch with his troops. It didn't help that he had a habit of alternating his top military commanders, rotating them between the eastern and western fronts, which made them too subservient to him, and they were reluctant to tell him the truth about how unpopular he was. Why was the army so hostile to him? Well, it seems to have started with his attempt to cut the Eastern Army's pay in 588. The troops mutinied for the best part of a year, and although the situation was resolved, we don't know how. Presumably, some sort of compromise was found. But this time, 14 years later, the situation seems to have been even more tense. The main reason was probably that the army felt unloved. It had fought well in Persia and ejected the Avars and Slavs from the Balkans. But where was the reward and recognition for that? By 602, Maurice had also reached the 20th year of his reign, and the army probably expected to receive a donative as a mark of respect and gratitude. If so, they were sorely disappointed. The coffers were empty and Maurice wouldn't pay them. In addition, as I mentioned in the last episode, in 599, Maurice hadn't ransomed 12,000 prisoners taken by the Avars. This was regarded as yet another example of his callous penny-pinching. They were in fact probably deserters whom Maurice didn't want back in the army, but it didn't do his reputation any good. Theophylact tells us the army voiced three principal concerns when they were told to cross the Danube, which were: 1. They wanted to store the booty taken in their last campaign somewhere safe, and they didn't think crossing the river with it was a good idea. 2. They wanted to rest their horses. And 3. They knew there were lots of barbarians on the north side of the river who would fight harder than ever before since their lands were being invaded. The army's commander-in-chief and bearer of the bad news was Peter, Maurice's brother, and he was probably too close to Maurice to stand up to him and tell him head-on he'd made a mistake and would have a full-scale rebellion on his hands if he didn't back down. Peter tried to find a compromise, but Maurice remained adamant the troops should cross the river. Interestingly, Theophylact hints there might have been some sort of agreement discussed, since he says the troops relented and started making preparations to cross by gathering boats. But it was the sudden onset of bad weather, storms and extreme cold, which made them appeal again to Peter for permission to stay south of the river. Peter addressed the army yet again, begging them to comply with the emperor's instructions, but his entreaty backfired and the soldiers stormed off. They formed their own assembly and appointed their own leader, raising him up on a shield, which traditionally and ominously meant declaring a pretender for the throne. This was a man called Phocas, who Theophylact described as a centurion, an outdated term in the late Roman army, which he probably used to imply he was a junior officer. But Theophylact was hostile to Phocas and wanted to make him sound more of an upstart than he really was, and in fact he was almost certainly one of the senior generals in the Balkans army. We know he was in his 50s, an experienced soldier who was clearly very popular with the rank and file. And, as we're about to discover, he was also a particularly ruthless and bloodthirsty operator. Peter fled with the news to Maurice, who made a series of bad decisions. He chose to downplay the revolt by holding chariot races in the capital, telling the spectators not to worry about the, quote, senseless disorder of the soldiers. He seems to have hoped the whole thing would blow over, and he was counting on the support of the blue and green factions in the city if he needed them. You recall these had been crushed by Justinian in the Nika riots in 531, but seem to have regained their power and influence by this time. He summoned their leaders, Sergius and Cosmas, to the palace and told them to prepare their supporters to man the walls, which was a traditional function of the circus factions, who nearly 150 years before had helped to rebuild the walls themselves when they'd been severely damaged by an earthquake, and Attila the Hun was marching at full speed on the city. As we've discussed in earlier episodes, their frenzied activity almost certainly saved the capital, which could otherwise have fallen to Attila. 150 years later, the faction leaders told the emperor he would have the support of 1,500 greens and 900 blues to man the walls for him. Maurice also sent ambassadors to Phocas, but to no avail, since the rebel rejected the offer to negotiate. Indeed, Phocas was a wily old fox. He was a step ahead of the befuddled old emperor the whole time. He discovered that Maurice's eldest son and heir to the throne, Theodosius, was hunting in a forest outside the city with his father-in-law Germanus. He rapidly sent him a message saying the soldiers wanted either him or Germanus to assume the purple, since they were fed up with Maurice's ungrateful and parsimonious behaviour. This was almost certainly a cunning pretext to sow discord in Maurice's family, and it was remarkably successful, since when Maurice discovered it, he made another error of judgment by recalling his son and Germanus, and in a rage accused them of plotting against him. He vented his anger against Germanus, particularly when he heard that Phocas's soldiers were stealing horses grazing outside the city, except for those that belonged to Germanus. This looked like evidence Germanus was in league with Phocas, and in his rage he even threatened to kill him. Theodosius, worried about his father-in-law, told Germanus to flee to the safety of a church. Maurice sent Stephen, one of the most distinguished imperial eunuchs, to the church to arrest Germanus, but he fled to Hagia Sophia itself. Maurice's rage intensified. He thrashed his own son, Theodosius, with a staff, claiming he was siding with Germanus against him, and dispatched a squad of imperial guardsmen to apprehend Germanus. This was yet another error of judgment, for he underestimated just how unpopular he was, not only with the army, but also with the inhabitants of Constantinople. For when they heard that the imperial guard was marching to Hagia Sophia to arrest Germanus, a mob gathered to protect him and hurled insults at the emperor. Why was an emperor who'd achieved so much so unpopular with the people? The answer lies with growing resentment against his parsimony that had been building for years despite his military victories, and which had had petrol poured on it by a particular incident only a few months previously. For earlier that year, he'd riled the city's inhabitants by failing to provide cheap bread to offset a shortage of food that led to famine in the capital over the winter of 601-2. In February 602, rioting broke out at the Feast of Candlemas, which tradition required the emperor to celebrate barefoot with the people. Stones were thrown at him. A bald man who looked like Maurice was put on a donkey, and crude insults were chanted, which were too rude for me to translate verbatim, but suggested the emperor was all too good at fathering children. He had 9 with his wife Constantina, but little else. The imperial guards restored order, and the next day the culprits were rounded up and banished from the city. But the punishment was brief, and Maurice quickly pardoned them. Maybe his leniency was a mistake, since the populace lost their fear of him, not something that happened, for example, to Justinian when he slaughtered 30,000 civilians in the Nika riots. To get back to that fateful day on the 22nd of November 602, what turned a crisis into a disaster was the behaviour of the circus factions. The Greens and Blues, who'd been manning the walls, and who Maurice mistakenly believed he could rely on, came down from the walls and joined the mob. The protest turned violent, and the house of one of Maurice's closest supporters, a senator and senior official named Constantine Lades, was burned down. Maurice made yet another unwise decision. Instead of meeting with the mob, making concessions and trying to regain their confidence, he simply fled the capital. In the middle of the night, he and his family, including Constantine Lades, dressed as common people and sailed out of the great palace's harbour across the Bosphorus. But they weren't lucky with the winds, which forced them to land at a church on the Gulf of Nicomedia, only about 45 miles from Constantinople. Maurice was suffering from gout and didn't want to travel any further by land. Although he and his family were dangerously within reach of Phocas's soldiers, they stayed there, and Maurice dispatched his son Theodosius, since father and son now seemed to be reconciled, together with Constantine Lades to go to Persia to request military help from Khosroes. Meanwhile, on the same morning that Maurice had fled, which was the 23rd of November, back in Constantinople, Phocas's troops had reached the city, when Theophylact tells us Germanus made his own bid for power by asking the Blues and Greens to make him emperor. But this didn't succeed because Sergius, leader of the Greens, felt Germanus would prefer the Blues over the Greens and refused to back him. With Phocas now just outside the city, Germanus quickly changed tack and, together with the Greens, expressed his support for the rebel. Regime change happened quickly. Phocas's troops gathered at the Hebdomon, the parade ground outside Constantinople, where he summoned the Senate and the Patriarch. According to Theophylact, he went through a pantomime of pretending not to be interested in the throne himself and proposed Germanus instead. But the circus factions called out their support for him, and in a nearby church the Patriarch crowned him emperor. It was then that, in Theophylact's words, quote, "disaster overcame prosperity, and the misfortunes of the Romans took their origin." 2 days later, Phocas, the murderous tyrant as Theophylact called him, was carried in the imperial carriage drawn by 4 white horses into the city where chariot races were held to celebrate his coronation. Phocas gave donatives to the soldiers which, had Maurice done the same, might have saved him. Then he placed a crown on his wife Leontia's head, and led her in a triumphal procession to the Augusteion, Justinian's grand square in front of Hagia Sophia. There it was customary for the circus factions to line the streets and applaud the new empress. But fighting broke out between the blues and greens, who were jostling for position. Phocas sent one of his lieutenants, Alexander, a particularly brutal soldier according to Theophylact, to sort out the disturbance. Alexander encountered Cosmas, the head of the blues, and they came to blows. Alexander knocked Cosmas to the ground, whereupon the blues yelled abuse, shouting, "Know thy place, Maurice is not dead." Phocas was taken aback by this veiled threat that Maurice could be restored to the throne. Immediately he dispatched soldiers to the church on the Gulf of Nicomedia where Maurice and his family were hiding. Incapacitated by his gout, Maurice didn't move. He was even said to have recalled his son Theodosius from going to Cosroes for help, but whether or not that was true is a question we'll revert to a little bit later. Maurice's entire family, apart from Theodosius, was with him. He had 9 children with his wife Constantina, 6 boys and 3 girls. They were all taken to the harbour of Eutropius in the city of Chalcedon, and there Maurice was forced to watch as 5 of his sons were beheaded in front of him. The youngest was only a baby, and Theophylact says one of the children's nurses tried to swap him with her own child, but Maurice exposed the ruse and insisted his own son be killed. Onlookers burst into tears when they saw milk was mingled with blood coming from the dead child's little body. Next, it was Maurice's turn. He's reputed to have accepted his death philosophically, saying, quote, "Thou art just, O Lord, and thy judgment is just," before he too was beheaded. But this was written years later in his homage, and we have, quite frankly, no idea how he really behaved. His wife and 3 daughters were the only ones spared, but, as we'll discover, not for long. Phocas's bloodthirsty brutality wasn't over. Probably on the same day he executed Maurice and his family, he also rounded up those generals who'd stayed loyal to Maurice. These included Maurice's brother Peter, who'd so conspicuously failed to quell the army's mutiny, the brave Commentiolus, who'd fought so valiantly on the Danube front, stemming the Avar and Slav invasions before the peace with Persia was declared, and also the senior officers Praesentinus and Philippicus. The only survivor was Germanus, who was forced to take holy orders and retire from public life. He owed his life to having betrayed Maurice, but even that wouldn't save him for long, as we'll discover in the next episode. Phocas put the heads of Maurice and his 5 sons on spears in the Heptamon outside the city gates, and thus began his 8-year reign, probably the most disastrous in the entire history of the Roman Empire. He was reviled by all our sources, both contemporaries and future chroniclers, as a repugnant and bloodthirsty tyrant, even by the standards of the violent world of the early 7th century. One historian has recently tried to revive his reputation by suggesting that he might have been quite a capable soldier. We'll review this in the next episode, and there may be some truth in it, but it certainly wasn't sufficient to offset the political damage he'd done to the empire. For Maurice had been the most successful emperor militarily since Diocletian had restored the empire in the crisis of the 3rd century. His only fault was to want to manage his budget carefully. Unlike Justinian, he was too lenient with his subjects and let their resentment grow. The direct cause of his downfall was a series of personal misjudgments, in my view, about how to handle the army's mutiny on the Danube, and it must be remembered that when these events happened, he was an old man, suffering from gout and probably other medical conditions, judging by his severe illness in 597, although we don't know what that was. He let his judgment become impaired, and he suffered the consequences. I promised to come back to the subject of what happened to Maurice's eldest son Theodosius. His head was missing from the gruesome display outside Constantinople. So, was he still alive? This became a burning question for contemporaries, and we still don't know the answer. Phocas was quick to communicate that Theodosius was dead. He said he'd been apprehended and executed when his father had ordered him to return from journeying to Chosroes to ask for help. But his head never joined those on display, so this didn't seem convincing. Rumours quickly circulated that he'd escaped, but as he never reappeared, the verdict was that he died on his travels. Nevertheless, the mystery of what happened to him offered those Romans who were now regretting they'd backed Phocas some hope that a legitimate heir to the throne might exist. And these hopes quickly became more earnest as the truth dawned on the inhabitants of the Roman Empire that the man they'd put on the throne was a monster. Rather more importantly, this view was not confined to the Romans. In faraway Ctesiphon, Chosroes II was shocked to learn what had befallen his benefactor, who'd been responsible for putting him on the throne, a man for whom he almost certainly had genuine affection. There was no question of watching idly. He ordered a period of national mourning in Persia for Maurice's death. The entire Persian army was mobilized. Revenge would be taken on the upstart usurper Phocas. The Persians were coming. Meanwhile, in a remote part of Anatolia, a revered holy man, Saint Theodore of Sicyon, who was reputed to have the power to perform miracles of healing and to foretell the future, told his monks to prepare for the coming of the devil, for after Maurice's death he predicted, quote, "worse things will happen, such as none of us expect." He was right. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. The next episode will be in a week's time on the 23rd of November, and we'll continue with the story of the last great war of antiquity. And if you like the podcast, please do join my mailing list on my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes, where you'll find maps, blogs, and a free ebook. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.